Joining me this morning to talk a little bit about his work in the nation's capital, 3rd District Congressman Ben Ray Lujan is joining us from his home in Nambe, New Mexico. Congressman, good morning. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Good morning, Scott. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to talk a little bit about some legislation that you have been involved with, and first and foremost is something about COVID-19 scams. There's a bunch of folks trying to take advantage of the pandemic, which I find hard to believe, but then again, nothing's hard to believe this year. So what's going on?
Yes, Scott. So sadly, there's a lot of bad actors out there that are preying on innocent people, trying to steal their personal information, trying to steal some of those stimulus checks, those personal checks that were sent to the American people that were included in the CARES Act. And it's been estimated that as much as about $30 billion in that stimulus might be stolen and taken as a result of fraud. We're also seeing an increase in the number of cases the Federal Trade Commission is tracking based on scams over the phone, scams online or through email as well. And so this legislation that I'm working with consumer groups and with states attorney generals would provide more tools to the Federal Trade Commission and to states attorney generals to file and apply penalties to these bad actors and provide more tools to hold them accountable. It's something that's desperately needed, and especially to our seniors, to military families, and to veterans who seem to be the ones that are being targeted and attacked. This is the least that should be done to be able to provide more support to help safeguard families during these tough times. More must be done, and this is one of the pieces of legislation I believe that will help deliver that difference.
Got you. And let me ask you, is there any existing laws on the books that can help from some of these scams and things? Don't we already have some things on the books for this?
So the FTC currently does not have the ability to apply civil penalties.
I see.
And this would also expand that to attorney generals with these kinds of scams. So that's why the legislation is needed. It's another tool, and it's a tool that I've been told by FTC commissioners as well as attorney generals and consumer groups that will make a positive difference. And that was a part of the hearing that we had just yesterday on this subject as well.
Right. And so could this legislation then, Congressman, be used in future scams or other things after this pandemic?
Most certainly. So this legislation would be used not just during these tough times, but going forward. And I'm also looking at legislation that will make this as expansive as we can create it, and also working with some of my colleagues and FTC commissioners because there's other predators out there and scammers that are also selling goods online and bidding them and selling them as made in America, even though they're not made in the United States. So we're looking at tools across the gamut that will protect consumers more and more.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, very good. And then I want to ask you, too, a little bit about your work with some of the tribal communities across the country. As we have seen, some hard-hit areas, of course, our neighbors, the Navajo Nation, right here in northwest New Mexico, that I know you're very familiar with, have had some tough times dealing with the coronavirus, and the numbers are still not where I think a lot of folks would like them to be, a lot lower for sure. But you've started talking about some other legislation and some maybe help for tribal communities in regards to maybe internet services and connectivity.
So, Scott, this week there was also a hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee, which I'm a proud member of, where we heard from tribal leaders and advocates about all that's happening as a result of COVID-19 and how hard communities have been hit. Now, we know historically that the United States government has not fulfilled its trust responsibilities based on treaties with sovereign nations in the United States of America, with our tribes and our pueblos. One of the witnesses at that hearing was President Nez of the Navajo Nation, who very clearly described the lack of running water that so many families don't have access to on the Navajo Nation, the lack of broadband access, the importance of more support for access to high-quality health care as well, and closing that broadband gap. And as a result of that hearing, we're seeing more members of Congress co-sponsor legislation that I and others have authored to provide more support to tribal communities and to the pueblos, not just during tough times, but going forward. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get some of these signed into law and that we can find bipartisan support to close these divides and address all of these injustices.
And that was going to be my next question to you, Congressman, was about the chances for passage through Congress and maybe getting to the president's desk for maybe both of these pieces of legislation we've talked about this morning, the scam legislation for COVID-19 and also maybe some of this infrastructure bill as well. What do you think? What are the chances?
So during the hearing, it sounded like there was a lot of bipartisan support for whether it was existing legislation or new ideas like the one that I just shared with you. So I'm optimistic that there will be bipartisan support and that these could be included in future measures. The infrastructure package, the House of Representatives has passed it. Sadly, Leader Mitch McConnell has said he's not interested in moving the House-passed infrastructure package. But I always am optimistic that the United States will benefit from jobs that will be created with investing in our roads, bridges, water, wastewater, and strengthening our schools, closing that broadband divide. It's so needed, and especially during these tough times, to create more jobs and invest in the country. That's where we should be working together on a bipartisan basis. President Trump's even called for an infrastructure package, and he suggested it should be a $2 trillion package. The House-passed legislation is 1.5, so there's still a lot of room for negotiation. And the only thing standing in the way right now is Mitch McConnell, and I'm hopeful that he'll find a way to make these investments for the good of the country.
Okay. Well, and we just had a conversation on this program yesterday about economic development and how broadband and internet connectivity can certainly be a driver when it comes to economic development in some of the more rural parts of our country. I would think that would have a place in this conversation too, right?
Most certainly. A $100 billion initiative that was including in the Moving America Act, many pieces of legislation that I've been proud to author that would close that broadband divide in rural and tribal communities, and something that's desperately needed, not just for economic opportunity for students now that are home and studying when we're working to reopen schools, but also for healthcare with telemedicine initiatives and closing that gap, and even to keep people safe, whether it's our first responders and law enforcement or victims of crimes. Closing that broadband gap will help everybody.
Certainly. Well, and of course, we're so dependent on it these days for everything from shopping sometimes to getting information through the press and also maybe even education in the fall. So internet connectivity certainly has become a big deal for a lot of families. I wanted to ask you too, Congressman, a little bit about an extension for these PPP loans, and those may help some New Mexico businesses, right?
That's right. So in the CARES package, the Congress worked on a bipartisan basis, and it was signed into law to create the PPP program, which is a program to allow for small businesses to apply for loans, low interest guaranteed loans, to help them with all the expenses that they're facing during these tough times. Since that time, we've increased the program with more investment and provided more flexibility to small businesses, whether they were recipients of the small loans or they're applying for loans in the future. That allows small businesses to use the loan for 6 months of expenses versus 2 months of expenses. These loans, for the most part, are forgivable, but for the parts of the loan that cannot be forgiven, it also allows small businesses to pay that back over 5 years versus 2 years, and to allow for the loans to be used for more expenses like rent and utilities and mortgage payments as well. And recently, we passed another piece of legislation, signed into law, that extends the time that a small business can apply for a PPP loan. And we encourage you to go reach out to your local community bankers or to your credit unions or the Farm Credit Bureau, the local SBDC office or SBA office, or you can reach out to myself or Senator Heinrich or Senator Udall, and we'd be happy to work with you as well to make sure that you're applying for those loans to help you with your small businesses. And the deadline was June 30th. It expired, but fortunately, the program has been expanded and extended to August 8th. And there's still about $120 billion in the program, Scott. So I want to encourage small businesses that have not applied, please take a look at the program, see if it works for you, and then let's work together to make sure that you have access to this important tool to help you during these tough times. Right.
We've talked about that program before here on KSJE, and I know a lot of folks have taken advantage of it through the Small Business Development Center and other entities that you mentioned, Congressman. So it's great to see that that's been extended and maybe made available to other businesses. And I think you're right, if it fits, because that's the big question. Folks need to figure out if that's going to work for them or not. Just a couple of minutes remaining this morning with you. I wanted to ask if you have any predictions on the fall. There's been a lot of talk from the education department about schools reopening or not reopening. I know the states are coming up with their plans. How do you feel about how things are looking for education in the fall?
Well, I think everyone wants to see our schools and our businesses, back up and running. But we're also following all the advice coming in from public health experts as well. And one of the concerns that I have, though, is President Trump has still not activated the full use of the Defense Production Act to make sure that everyone across the United States, including here in New Mexico, for small businesses, essential workers, healthcare workers, students, that they have access to all the PPE, that's that protective gear with face masks, rubber gloves, eye covering, face coverings, gowns, whatever may be needed to keep them safe. We also have not seen the United States meet the answer and the call to provide enough testing in America. It's now estimated through my questioning with the CDC director, the FDA director, and Dr. Fauci recently, that the United States needs upwards of 900,000 tests per day, and that we're just over 500,000 tests, still not where we need to be. And remember, President Trump back in April said there'd be 5 million tests being administered a day in the United States. We're just about 10% of that. More tests are needed to help us get back to normal, so that way if someone has COVID-19, we can diagnose it sooner, we can keep people safe and stop the spread, and that's what needs to happen to be able to get everything opened up sooner. So I know the governor is working with superintendents, with principals, with teachers, and families across New Mexico, but there are a lot of plans and work that has to be done to make sure that everyone's going to be safe and be in the strongest learning environment as well. And so we're going to keep a close eye on this, but I, along with fellow New Mexicans, I know that we all want to see things get back to normal as soon as possible.
That's true. As soon as safely possible, I think, is correct as well. Well, Congressman, I appreciate your time this morning. Are you going to be heading back to Washington anytime soon, or is this a recess for you and your colleagues?
So the last 2 weeks of July and the beginning of August will be in session again, passing appropriation bills, the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some important legislation in the Natural Resources Committee that benefits New Mexico as well. So we'll be getting back to get that done. And a big part of that package, I'm hoping we'll get some positive news on infrastructure and also on the next phase of funding for local governments, for schools, for small businesses, and people across New Mexico with the response to COVID-19.
Well, very good, Congressman Ben Ray Lujan. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I appreciate it. Stay safe.
You as well, Scott. Good to be with you.
All right. Thank you very much. That is Congressman Ben Ray Lujan from his home in Nambe, New Mexico, my guest here on KSJE.